You weren't supposed to hear this. You weren't supposed to know. What I'm about to tell you has been erased, buried, stitched into silence by those who understood that truth, if ever unleashed, would infect the minds of men and awaken something far more dangerous than fear, curiosity. And yet, here you are. Tonight, you will cross a line you can never uncross. Because this isn't just history, it's forbidden history, stained in blood, lust, and hunger that should have never been named aloud. In the mountains of Eastern Europe, 1936, a police file was quietly stamped, closed, unsolved. But what the file concealed was darker than the crime it pretended to document. Entire villages whispered of people who had broken the oldest laws of nature, not merely killers, not merely cannibals, but incestuous tribes that lived in shadows, feeding on their own bloodlines, devouring flesh with a ritualistic devotion that made even hardened soldiers tremble. These weren't wild rumors. These were cold testimonies, sealed under lock and key to be forgotten by every generation after, until now. Imagine the forests, endless, black and silent. Imagine stumbling on a cabin that reeks of smoke and iron, the smell of meat that isn't from any animal you've ever hunted. Imagine finding bones not buried but arranged, teeth marks etched into them like signatures. This is not folklore, this is documented, a lost investigation, redacted, suppressed. And what it reveals is not only the existence of incestuous cannibal tribes, but the reason why governments, churches, and entire institutions of power chose to suffocate the story before the world could see what they had found. Because the deeper truth is this: what happened in those mountains was not an accident of isolation. It wasn't madness, it wasn't hunger. It was control, ritualized, generational control, engineered to destroy the individuality of a man and remake him into something else entirely. The tribe fed not only on flesh, but on obedience. They used incest not simply as degradation, but as domination, removing the idea of choice, trapping their offspring in a cycle of loyalty so complete it became unbreakable. What was left were humans who could no longer think of themselves as human. They became instruments, living tools, and the hunger was the chain. Ask yourself, why would anyone protect this truth? Why not let it be known if it was just some monstrous family tucked away in the wilderness? The answer is obvious the moment you think of it, because once you know this tribe existed, you begin to wonder how many more there were. You begin to notice that cannibalism and incest rituals are recorded in every corner of ancient history, from Babylon to Rome, from Celtic tribes to hidden cults in rural America. You begin to see the pattern, that rulers, priests, and kings have always hidden a darker appetite, the kind of appetite that binds followers in absolute submission. And that is the secret that would rip the mask off of power itself. Because cannibalism was never just about hunger, it was about control. Incest was never just corruption, it was about ownership. These tribes weren't barbaric mistakes, they were echoes of something ancient, something institutionally preserved and kept alive in shadows, to remind the elite of what true power feels like, not commanding armies, but commanding bloodlines. Now, before we go further, tell me, where are you watching this from? Write it in the comments. Let me see where this forbidden knowledge is landing tonight. Because what comes next is not easy to hear. In fact, most men will click away, too uncomfortable to face what lies beneath the official history of civilization. But not you. If you're still here, you're ready to be broken open. To be initiated. To walk deeper into the black forest of truth where no man returns unchanged. This is where it begins. The case file stamped closed, 1936, the cold case that was never cold at all. Picture a patrol unit in the Carpathian foothills, winter of 1936, the air sharp enough to split skin, snow thick enough to muffle sound. A group of gendarmes, young and already exhausted by hunger and cold, stumble across tracks in the drifts. At first, they think it's wolves, but wolves don't leave barefoot prints, and wolves don't walk in circles around their prey. The men follow the prints up into the pines, rifles shaking in their frozen hands, until they see it, what looks like a cabin, but not a cabin built for warmth or shelter. No, this place looks wrong. The wood is blackened as if scorched, the windows boarded, smoke crawling from a chimney like the last breath of something diseased. They knock. No one answers. They break the door. And what they find inside becomes the reason this case will be buried. Bones boiled down until they shine white. A child's skull used as a drinking vessel. Strings of tendon hanging like drying herbs. And in the center, families. Not strangers, not raiders, but families, locked together in ways no one outside those walls could comprehend. Brother with sister, mother with son. Generations collapsed into one continuous coil of flesh and hunger. The soldiers don't write everything down. How could they? The official record reduces it to evidence of cannibalism. But what it doesn't say, and what one officer would later whisper to his priest before hanging himself, is that the tribe didn't resist them. They welcomed them. They smiled, teeth red and cracked, as though they'd been waiting. And when the gendarmes tried to separate them, the tribe began to chant, a low, guttural sound that crawled into the men's ears and made their stomachs twist. One soldier vomited, another dropped his weapon and fled. But the youngest officer, barely 20, claimed he understood a word buried inside the chanting. Obedience, not screamed, not begged, but offered, as though these people were not resisting arrest, but inviting absorption, offering their sickness like a gift. This detail never made it into the file, but it explains why the local commander ordered the cabin burned the same night, ordered the tribe sealed inside, screaming, chanting, clawing at the walls until their voices went silent under the roar of flame. Case closed. Not even close, because 3 days later, the commander himself disappeared. His family slaughtered in their home, though not by fire. Their bones bore the same teeth marks found in the cabin. No suspects ever arrested, no bodies ever recovered. And that was when the order came down from above. Not local police, not even military command. Higher. Seal the records, silence the press, contain the hysteria. And for decades, nothing more was said. Why? Because this wasn't just a backwards horror. This was evidence of a ritual order older than Christianity itself. Anthropologists whispered of tribes that fused incest and cannibalism to collapse individuality, creating bloodlines that were no longer families but chains. They said it was a control system, a living experiment in submission, and here it was, in 1936, rediscovered, burning in a cabin that officials had to erase. But I'll tell you what they feared most. Not the horror of what those people did. What they feared was the mirror, because in the chanting of those tribes, you hear the same rhythm in church liturgies, in military marches, in political rallies, the same hypnosis of repetition, locking men into obedience. The tribe was simply more honest about it. They consumed each other literally. Civilization consumes each other symbolically. So the file was sealed, and you were never supposed to know. But you do now. Think carefully about what you just heard. Incest and cannibalism bound together, not as random savagery, but as a method. Most people recoil at the horror and stop there. But if you push past revulsion, if you ask why such acts repeat across history, a darker clarity emerges. Because incest and cannibalism aren't accidents of hunger, they're tools. Tools designed to shatter the human mind and forge it into something new. Start with incest. The first law every civilization agrees on, the line that separates us from chaos, is that blood should not fold back into itself. The incest taboo is primal, instinctive. It protects individuality, diversifies the gene pool, and keeps identity free from collapse. Break that law deliberately, ritualize it, and what happens? A child grows up never able to imagine love outside obedience. They cannot escape. Their world is sealed. There is no outside family, there is no stranger, there is no possibility of rebellion. Incest reduces human possibility to a closed loop. It is not just corruption, it is ownership, carved into flesh. Now add cannibalism. The second law of humanity, you do not consume your own kind. To break this is to break the barrier between self and other. To eat the flesh of your kin is not just an act of hunger, it is a declaration that individuality has no meaning. What was once you can become me. What was once sacred is now resource. Every moral instinct fractures, and when morality fractures, obedience is the only thing left standing. Combine the two, incest and cannibalism, and you create something worse than monsters. You create dependence. Humans who are conditioned to accept degradation as love, consumption as loyalty, submission as survival. The tribe becomes a single organism, fed by its own blood and bone, with no individuality left to resist. That's why the chanting struck fear into hardened soldier. It wasn't random noise, it was programming, the repetition of obedience reinforced by flesh, sealed by bloodlines. Do you see it yet? These weren't feral people. They were experiments. Whether ancient or engineered, it no longer matters. What matters is that this model of control didn't die in the flames of 1936. It survived because it didn't just exist in the mountains. It exists wherever power wants absolute submission. Governments, religions, corporations, what are they if not tribes demanding obedience, even to the point of consuming you alive in spirit if not in flesh? Look around. You've seen the symbolic echoes everywhere, bread and wine consumed as body and blood, oaths sworn to family dynasties where the bloodline rules all, military units chanting in unison until individuality is erased and only obedience remains. These aren't coincidences. They are fragments of the same ancient logic. Break the man, bind the man, remake the man. The incestuous cannibal tribe of 1936 was simply an unmasked version. The rituals were raw, physical, undeniable, but our so-called civilized world hides them in symbols, in systems, in ceremonies. You think you are free because you recoil from the tribe's horror, but ask yourself, how different are you? If you obey the chant of flags, the chant of prayers, the chant of advertisements, until you forget where you end and the tribe begins. This is why the file was sealed, not because of what it revealed about savages, but because of what it revealed about us. There is a map that historians rarely draw on public walls. It's not geopolitical, it's moral. Trace the lines and you'll see the same dark geography repeating, places where the sacred becomes edible, where ritual turns a human body into a sign, where the act of consuming another's flesh is less about calories and more about messaging. The Carpathian cabin of 1936 sits on that map like a burned pin. It's a node. And when you study the nodes, a pattern emerges, not of isolated madness, but of ritual logic repeated through the centuries, shaped by the same hunger to transform the self by consuming the other. Look at Babylon. In the clay tablets, scholars find references not to ordinary feasting, but to rites that blur the line between sacrifice and absorption. Kings who ate the flesh of vanquished enemies, if the texts are read with the dark lens applied, were not simple cannibals. They were performing an act of metaphysical annexation. If you ingest an enemy, you take their strength, their name, their right to resistance. It is a brutal theology of transfer. Turn to Rome. The rhetoric is less explicit, the acts more concealed. Yet in the triumphal feasts after conquest, the conquered are reduced to spectacle. Roman elites did not dine publicly on their enemies. They performed rituals that made the enemy's body a currency, a way to display ownership. The feast, the parade, the public desecration, all speak the same language. The body can be turned into a sign of domination. Across the Atlantic, pre-modern Mesoamerica shows another variation. Sacrifice here was theater, a covenant between rulers and gods. Bodies were given, sometimes consumed in symbolic ways, to show the ruler's link to the sacred. Anthropologists argue about details, but the message is unmistakable. Consuming the sacred or the sacrificed is a way to bind the community and cement authority, whether prayers fired. A literal flesh was tasted or not. The symbolism of consumption, of taking in what is offered, functioned as governance. Even in Europe's own folklore we find echoes. Hunting feasts where the noble lord shares meat from slaughtered animals with his vassals. Brotherhood rites where passing food from mouth to mouth creates bonds that override ordinary kinship. These are not pretty rituals of fellowship. They are mechanisms of control, choreographies that teach who gives and who receives, who commands and who obeys. That's the link between the Carpathian cabin and these ancient customs. The cabin's acts were more blunt, more obscene, yes, But the mechanism was the same: ritual consumption, rewired social identity. The tribe in the siding dark of those pines used flesh as a language of control, and the elites of civilization, kings, priests, generals, learned to speak that language more subtly. They clothed it in doctrine, ceremony, and law, so it would be acceptable, respectable, and ultimately indiscernible. So why bury the cabin? Why seal the reports and hush the press? Because the cabin made the abstraction visible. It revealed the structural truth that civilized institutions rely on the same patterns to hold people in a state of compliance. That idea is dangerous because it collapses the comforting illusion that we are above them. It suggests that history's rituals of dominance didn't disappear. They were refined, hidden inside liturgies, oaths, parades, and the daily necessities that ask you to sacrifice a piece of yourself. Power learned to sanitize the act of consumption. It removed the gore and kept the effect. Universities, corporations, churches all ask for small acts of ingestion from their followers. Accept the doctrine, swallow the narrative, attend the ritual, repeat the chant. Over time, those little ingestions compound. The body is not eaten in the literal sense, but the mind is consumed. Identity is slowly converted into compliance. And that's what made the 1936 case intolerable to the institutions that found it. The cabin's horror stripped the gesture of ceremony, showing raw what ceremony covers. The image of bones arranged like offerings, of pots of meat over slow flames, of chanting that dissolved resistance. It was a live demonstration of the mechanism behind their own tools. You should be angry at that, not merely disgusted. Disgust keeps you at the surface. Anger sharpens your sight. Once you understand the technique, consumption as control, you begin to see it everywhere, not as a conspiracy theory with tangled webs and shadowy cabals, but as an operational template. The question becomes less who did it and more who benefits. Where are the modern feasts of obedience? Which institutions are asking you to ingest narratives, to swallow identities, and in exchange, what are they taking from you? This is not academic curiosity, it is an attack plan. If the cabin's logic exists in stone tablets and in boardrooms, then recognizing it becomes your first defense. Recognize the ritual, refuse the repeat ingestion, question the ceremonies offered to you in the name of belonging. The map grows darker the more pins you add, but every map is also a way out. When you see the pattern, you can choose not to follow the route laid out for you. That is the pivot we will explore next, how the modern systems perfected symbolic consumption and how small acts of refusal can begin to dismantle them. Now ask yourself this: if a small mountain tribe in 1936 were truly nothing more than deranged peasants gone mad, why silence the story? Why stamp closed across the file and order the evidence incinerated? If madness is all it was, then publicizing it would only reinforce the state's authority. See, we keep you safe from monsters, but that's not what happened. Instead, secrecy was enforced, reports were buried, witnesses were reassigned, and the only conclusion you can draw is the most dangerous one. The truth was too similar to what already existed in the halls of power. Understand this: suppression is itself a ritual. When an institution covers, denies, and erases, it isn't only protecting the public from panic, it's protecting its own reflection from being recognized. Because what people glimpsed in that Carpathian cabin was not some alien nightmare. It was a grotesque echo of their own political systems, their own religious structures, their own social hierarchies. That is the knowledge the state couldn't afford to let spread. There's a rhythm to it. First comes discovery, a horror too raw to ignore. Then comes recognition, the faint but unmistakable resemblance to official ceremonies, official orders, official doctrines. Then comes suppression, the burial of both evidence and memory so that the resemblance can be forgotten. This rhythm has repeated through history like a drumbeat under civilization's march. Look at witch trials, not simply about witches, but about burning the idea of alternative power. Look at heresy hunts, not about the words of heretics, but about suppressing dangerous resemblances to truths too close to the church's own secrets. Look at governments silencing war crimes, not only about hiding blood, but about hiding the mirror. Because if the mirror is left in plain sight, the public begins to ask, how different are our rulers from the etched monsters they condemn? The Carpathian case followed the same rhythm. The soldiers' reports should have been national news, but instead the press received orders. Insanity, starvation, no need to panic. Files were sealed, families were told to remain silent, and the young officer who claimed he understood the chanting word, obedience, was quietly transferred and later found hanging from a beam in his own home. Officially a suicide. Unofficially, another echo buried with the others. And here is where the descent sharpens. Suppression doesn't erase. It consecrates. When a story is buried, it doesn't vanish. It transforms into myth, into whisper, into shadow knowledge that men stumble upon decades later, the way you are stumbling into it now. And myth, unlike headlines, cannot be controlled once it begins to circulate. Myth lives in silence, in unease, in the mind of the man who asks, "Why was I not allowed to know this?" That question alone is enough to fracture obedience. That is why you are here, not to hear about monsters in the woods, but to see how the act of hiding those monsters reveals the system itself. Every cover-up is a confession, every sealed file is proof of resemblance, and every time you find one, you are meant to feel exactly what you are feeling right now, the creeping realization that the rituals of consumption and obedience are not relics of the past, they are structural pillars of the present. The cabin burned, the files sealed, but the pattern survived, and the institutions that silenced it still chant today, in parades, in churches, in advertisements, in political slogans, all demanding the same obedience once demanded in that pine dark room. Ritual is a language, and every powerful group learns to speak it. When the Carpathian cabin was buried, the pattern it revealed didn't die, it migrated. The same structure that fused body and obedience reappeared dressed in velvet and oaths, inside rooms with polished wood and candlelight, behind locked doors where men in nice suits traded promises in Latin. Secret societies did not invent ritual consumption. They refined it. They took the raw mechanics of domination, the breaking of individuality, the binding of lineage, the sanctification of obedience, and repackaged them as initiation, loyalty, and fraternity. That repackaging made the mechanism usable across centuries. Think of initiation rites. Across cultures, from warrior bands to religious orders, the aspirant is separated, humiliated, and remade. That three-step method, isolate the recruit, degrade their prior identity, and then rebirth them into the group, is the control technology. The Carpathian tribe did it with the most brutal literalism. Isolation by bloodlines, degradation by enforced roles, rebirth through ritual consumption. Secret societies learned to achieve the same internal result with fewer burned pots and more ritual theater, blindfolds instead of fire, oaths instead of cannibal feasts, symbols instead of bones. But the goal remained identical, to turn men into instruments who will obey without question. Look at the old orders, the ones written about in dry academic pages and whispered about in taverns, knights, cloistered monks, esoteric fraternities. They used symbols, shared meals with prescribed meanings, and administered oaths that were binding under penalty of shame or exile. The language changed, but the effect did not. If you force a man to enact a script, sing the same words, perform the same gestures, consume the same bread in the same manner, you create shared neural pathways. You make him less an individual and more a node in a network. That is how loyalty becomes absolute. Then there are blood oaths and lineage claims. Many elite groups cloak bloodlines in myth. We are descendants of kings. We preserve an ancient line. We are the keepers of a secret flame. Whether literal or symbolic, these claims function like the tribe's inward-turning family structure. They create an idea of belonging that is exclusive and self-validating. The result? Members behave less like citizens and more like heirs. Heirs protect inheritance. They protect it fiercely. They will silence embarrassment, crush leaks, and bury anything that risks exposure. Powerful groups also mastered theater, parades, banquets, and coded ceremonies. At their center is a shared consumption, a communal meal, a sacred drink, a symbolic sharing of elements, all carrying layered meanings about who is included and who is outside. In public, these acts become respectable. Private, they become binding. The modern elite amplified the effect by institutionalizing it. Charity galas, fellowship dinners, boardroom rituals where newcomers are brought into the fold. Look closely at the choreography. Notice who serves and who is served, who gives and who receives. It's not an innocent tradition, it's a script for loyalty. More dangerous still is how these societies weaponized secrecy. The Carpathian case was buried not only to hide horror, but to protect a template. When secrecy becomes sacred, the act of exposure is framed as blasphemy. The whistleblower is not a civic actor, but a traitor to the ritual. That dynamic prevents outsiders from interrogating the mechanism because, structurally, anyone who asks too loudly risks being cast out. Silence becomes a tool of cohesion, and cohesion becomes a mechanism of domination. Now connect the dots to modern institutions. Boardrooms borrow initiation scripts from lodges. Political staffs rehearse loyalty pledges that mirror cloistered orders. Media narratives act as communal meals where the same ideas are consumed and digested by millions at once. The raw horror of the cabin is gone. In its place is a sanitized machinery that achieves the same psychological outcome. Men who will close ranks, protect secrets, and obey the rhythms of power as if they were breathing. This is not fanciful conjecture. It is structural analysis. Ritual, secrecy, symbolic consumption, and lineage claims are tools, and tools are used by those who want to hold others. The men who found the cabin in 1936 smelled more than smoke. They smelled a method. That method learned to walk in suits, to speak through policy memos, to hide beneath philanthropy. The cost of recognition is high. Once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee the choreography. You begin to notice the faint echoes everywhere, in initiation handshakes, in the cadence of speeches, in the way certain institutions protect their own with ritualized silence. Listen now, because this is where the method grows teeth and walks the streets in uniform. The Carpathian cabin was a brutal laboratory for domination. The military is its most efficient factory. Soldiers are not born to obey as they are taught obedience, forged in drills, chants, and rituals that remove hesitation and replace it with execution. That training is a refined form of what the tribe used in the Pines. Isolate the recruit, break his prior loyalties, burn away the old identity, and reforge him into an instrument whose primary virtue is unquestioning service. Think of basic training as a ritualized script. You arrive alone, you are stripped of your civilian clothing and your name, you are given a new designation and a new rhythm. You march, you chant, you share meals in silence with men who are told to mirror one another. Those meals are small, but they are meaningful. To eat with others under the same system, to accept the same rations, to obey the same orders, these are tiny acts of consumption that compound into a single cohesive identity. Over time, the recruit's inner voice quiets. He learns to take orders before he thinks to question them. That's not accidental. It's design. The military needs men who can act without delay, but design can be repurposed. The same mechanisms that produce disciplined soldiers can, in different hands, produce men who protect secrets, who obey loyalty oaths beyond the law, who keep silence when the cost of speaking becomes exile. The ritual becomes less about defending a nation and more about preserving a network. And once you see how easily a shared regimen can be redirected, the line between defense and domination blurs. Religion, too, borrows that choreography. Not all faiths, not all services, but the architectures of ritual, sacrament, and repetition are tools of psychological shaping. Communion-like meals, repetitis. I've liturgies, consecrated spaces where conformance is the norm. These are methods that create a shared inner map. When your moral compass is calibrated by a single liturgy, deviation isn't merely frowned upon. It becomes a kind of betrayal. The community protects itself by ritualizing exclusion. The same mechanism that binds congregations can be weaponized to shield clergy and institutions from scrutiny. Now watch corporations, the corporate retreat, the weekend of team-building exercises, the founder's story recited like a catechism, the ceremonial passing of the torch is the tribe's initiation rewritten for profit. Executives speak in the cadences of priests, mission vision, values. Employees are coaxed to internalize those words until they function as instincts. They buy in, not because the product demands it, but because belonging is rewarded. Promotions, insider access, social status, and those rewards create loyalty that no legal contract fully captures. What's critical here is ritual subtlety. The cabin had no subtlety. It screamed. Modern institutions whisper. They replace the physical with the symbolic. Branded apparel instead of blood. Loyalty bonuses instead of fealty rings. Corporate retreats instead of initiation fires. But the psychological architecture is identical. Repeat a phrase enough times, perform a pledge enough times, and neural grooves deepen. The mind prefers the groove. It takes effort to crawl out. Secrecy sharpens these structures. Institutions that prize reputation over truth become guardians of the mirror that would reveal their methods. When abuse surfaces, the response is rarely transparency. It is containment. Legal teams, NDAs, private settlements, all modern mechanisms that serve the same function as burning files and silencing witnesses. They are the sanitized flames that protect the network's continuity. The cabin's sup. Oppression is mirrored by boardrooms and chancelleries, and the effect is the same. The ritual remains intact, the method preserved. There is a moral trade-off at work. The structures that create cohesion also enable corruption. The same mechanisms that produce a brave soldier can produce a soldier who covers war crimes. The same rites that build a faithful congregation can produce a church that shields predators. The shared consumption that binds a company can become an apparatus for protecting executives from accountability. That's the cruel calculus of ritualized loyalty. It concentrates protection and therefore concentrates impunity. This is not a call to dismantle every institution that uses ritual. Ritual is human. It binds us. The point is awareness. When you understand the architecture of obedience, the small compounding acts of symbolic consumption, the rituals that recalibrate identity, the secrecy that consecrates silence, you can spot when the structure is being used to dominate rather than to serve, and once you can spot it, you can refuse the next choreography offered to you. Hold that refusal as a weapon. In the next section, we will walk into the corridors where these patterns intersect with law and media. Places where perception is shaped and narratives are fed to entire nations. That's where the ritual moves from private to public, and where the stakes rise for every man who thinks he's still free. You've seen how ritual binds soldiers, congregations, and corporations, but the most insidious theater of ritual isn't hidden in barracks or temples. It's broadcast through the glowing screens in every living room. Media is the cathedral of the modern world, and its priests don't wear robes. They wear suits, hold microphones, and read scripts written not to inform, but to direct perception. The method is the same as the cabin's whispers by the fire: repetition, rhythm, symbols. You don't consume flesh, you consume headlines. You don't drink blood, you drink the nightly news. And each time you swallow it without question, your identity is nudged, your worldview rewritten one frame at a time. The real power is not in what they say, but in what they leave unsaid. Silence becomes a sculptor, carving away the possibilities your mind might have considered. You're told what to fear, what to pity, what to despise. Wars are sold with images of crying children, but not the images of the markets bombed the week before. Scandals are framed as accidents, but the patterns connecting them are blurred, fragmented, never allowed to form into something whole. Here's the brutal truth. Perception management is not a theory. It is a business model. Governments learned long ago that wars could not be fought without stories to justify them. Corporations discovered that markets could not be captured without narratives to entice desire. Institutions realized that loyalty could not be maintained without fear of the outsider, the heretic, the rival tribe. Each headline, each advertisement, each curated outrage is a ritual sacrifice, your independent thought placed upon the altar of their agenda. Notice the choreography. A crisis breaks. Within hours, every major outlet is speaking the same phrases, not similar, identical. A chorus, the repetition of key words: think back, shock, and awe. When weapons of mass destruction flatten the curve. These are not random phrases, they are mantras engineered to bypass debate and create instinctive compliance. And once that instinct is installed, the deeper truth, the contradictions, the missing evidence, the corrupted interests vanish from the collective mind. The cabin's tribe controlled their world through terror and silence. Modern institutions control entire nations through narrative and omission. Both techniques achieve the same outcome. Men and women who could resist do not, because their mental landscape has already been framed by someone else's script. And here is the darkest part. The media's power is parasitic. It requires your attention to live. Your gaze is the offering. Each time you lean forward, eyes locked on the screen, you are participating in the ritual. The more you watch, the stronger the pattern grows in you. That is why silence is so rare now, why distraction is constant. If you had time to think, to notice the shape of the ritual, you might refuse it. Ask yourself, who benefits from your fear? Who profits from your outrage? Who strengthens their position every time you repeat their words in casual conversation, never realizing you're spreading their chosen gospel? And pause here. I want you to comment below where in the world you are watching this from. Not for me, but for you. When you write it, you are marking your awareness in public. You are saying, I see the ritual for what it is, and I am naming myself outside it. That single act breaks the choreography. The law. It pretends to be blind, impartial, balanced on scales of reason. But history tells another story. Law is not a shield. It is a weapon. And like all weapons, it serves whoever grips the handle. When the tribe in the cabin enforced their codes, they did not ask for consent. They declared what was forbidden, and punishment followed swiftly, mercilessly. Modern systems claim refinement, but peel away the robes and you'll see the same bones beneath. Think carefully. Why does every law begin with a declaration, a text, a creed? Because words written into stone, parchment, or code are not suggestions. They are spells. They summon obedience. The ritual of law is linguistic alchemy. Ink on paper becomes the difference between freedom and a cell, between survival and ruin. Men in robes or suits gather, pronounce, and suddenly the course of your life shifts, not because morality shifted, but because the words were invoked against you. Now, look at the machinery beneath the surface. Who writes these laws? Rarely the people. Legislators, often funded and flattered by those who benefit most, compose them. Corporate lobbyists inject phrases, carve out exceptions, engineer loopholes so precise they become hidden escape hatches for the elite. This is the same mechanism as the carved symbols found near Catherine's body, marks that spoke to insiders, codes invisible to the uninitiated. The public sees justice, the initiated see protection. And when these laws are enforced, the scales tilt. A poor man steals bread and becomes a felon. A banker manipulates billions and receives a fine lighter than a year's rent. This is no accident. It is structural, a continuation of the ancient method. Punish the weak visibly to reinforce obedience, shield the powerful invisibly to maintain control. Terror in the cabin, bureaucracy in the courthouse, both ensure submission. But notice the deeper trick. Law is not just enforcement, it's theater. The courthouse, with its columns and flags, is a stage designed to project sanctity. The judge's robe is costume, the gavel a prop, the oath a ritual incantation. These symbols hypnotize the public into mistaking performance for principle. The trial does not reveal truth. It arranges narratives within a sanctioned framework. Evidence is excluded, stories are shaped, and truth itself becomes irrelevant once the verdict is spoken. Ask yourself, how many atrocities were made legal before they were condemned? Slavery, segregation, sterilization, wars waged on false pretenses, each carried the blessing of law at its inception. Legality is not morality. Legality is obedience codified. The tribe had no parchment. Their law was whispered threats. Today we call it jurisprudence, but the essence is unchanged. It exists to bind you, not to free you. And yet, law has a peculiar duality. It enslaves, but it also betrays its masters. The very need to write it down exposes their intentions. Every statute, every clause, every exception is a window into the fears of the elite. What they criminalize reveals what they fear losing control over. What they exempt themselves from reveals where their power truly lies. That is why the most dangerous men are not those who break laws, but those who study them, who read the inscriptions like archaeologists deciphering a forgotten ritual. Now understand this. Once law intertwines with media, The grip becomes absolute. Narratives shape perception, law enforces the boundaries of those narratives, and suddenly, entire populations live inside a cage without bars. They cannot see the edges, but they feel the walls whenever they resist. That is the perfection of control, a prison that convinces you it is freedom. Power hides in blood. Long before constitutions and parliaments, tribes knew that authority passed not by merit, but by lineage. The cabin dwellers, incestuous and cannibalistic, preserved their dominance by consuming their own, a grotesque ritual that kept their bloodline sealed against intrusion. In more polished halls, the same principle remained. Royal families intermarried generation after generation, not out of romance but calculation. The Habsburg jaw, deformed and unmistakable, was not an accident. It was the scar of centuries of controlled breeding, a physical marker of obsession with purity and continuity. Bloodlines were never just biology. They were codes of loyalty, silent compacts carried in the body itself. To belong by birth meant access to secrets, to inherit not just land, but rituals, not just wealth, but networks. To marry outside was betrayal. To dilute the line was to weaken the chain of command. This obsession with lineage produced both kings and tyrants, emperors and despots. The blood carried the story, and to preserve the story they were willing to deform the flesh. These dynasties did not vanish. They evolved, titles dissolved, but fortunes endured, estates turned into corporations, crowns into board seats, thrones into foundations and trusts. Names changed, but the blood remained the same. Families that once waged wars now wage influence campaigns. They fund universities, dictate economic policy, manipulate elections, and the public applauds their philanthropy without realizing that every donation is a reinvestment in loyalty, a ritual sacrifice that keeps their name carved into the bones of civilization. Look at the great banking families of Europe. Look at American dynasties that stretch from robber barons to senators. Their continuity is not coincidence. It is ritualized survival, where ordinary men spend lifetimes accumulating scrap. As these families play on a centuries-long chessboard, marriage is a merger, birth is a transaction, death is a redistribution of assets carefully guarded against outsiders. Even tragedy is leveraged. The fallen heir becomes a myth. The surviving branch grows stronger. The story retold as destiny. The incestuous tribe in the mountains preserved their power by devouring their own flesh. Modern dynasties preserve theirs by devouring nations. Resources, labor, currencies, all consumed to keep the lineage intact. And like the tribe, they operate in secrecy. You see the public face, the philanthropist, the statesman, the visionary. But behind that face is the same fixation, survival of the bloodline at all costs. Their control extends beyond wealth. It seeps into law and narrative, bending institutions to serve their continuity. Schools teach their histories, not the histories of those erased. Media glorifies their philanthropy, not their exploitation. Courts protect their assets, not the lives trampled to acquire them. Even revolutions which claim to overthrow them often end up enthroning new dynasties. Different names, same patterns, the ritual unchanged. The chilling truth is this: you are ruled not by elected officials or temporary administrations, but by families who have outlived empires. They understand time differently. Where you see decades, they see centuries. Where you see retirement, they see succession. Their loyalty is not to nations or ideologies, but to their blood. And in their eyes, you are not a citizen. You are resource, fodder, currency. The tribe in the cabin was grotesque because it was visible, raw, without disguise. Modern dynasties are grotesque because they are hidden in plain sight, wrapped in silk and ceremony, their rituals disguised as tradition, their consumption refined into commerce. The method never ended. It only became harder too. See, every dynasty requires a tool sharper than gold or land. Myth. A family cannot hold power for centuries unless it convinces the world that its rule is inevitable, natural, ordained. The incestuous tribe cloaked its brutality in stories of spirits demanding sacrifice. Those tales were not decorations, they were weapons. They turned horror into ritual, obedience into destiny. Modern families, wealthier and cleaner, do the same. Their myths are not of forest gods, but of destiny, patriotism, progress. Think of the crowns of Europe. Kings claimed divine right, an unbroken thread from heaven to their blood. That was not faith, that was strategy. If a population believed their monarch carried a spark of divinity, resistance became heresy. The peasants feared not only punishment but eternal damnation. That is the perfection of myth, to chain a man's body by first chaining his soul. Consider America's dynasties. They too weave myths, though they wear no crowns. Industrial barons recast themselves as self-made men, visionaries who clawed their way upward. Their descendants maintain the illusion of innovation and merit, while inheriting wealth vast enough to smother entire markets. The myth hides the truth. Their power is not earned, it is preserved. A ritual of continuity disguised as meritocracy. But myth alone is fragile. It must be embodied, made visible in stone, steel, and ritual. Cathedrals rose in Europe not just as places of worship, but as propaganda towers, monuments that proclaimed the immensity of divine authority. Today, skyscrapers do the same. They dominate skylines not to house workers, but to signal dominance. Every skyline is a hymn to power, every gala a liturgy, every foundation dinner a reenactment of authority disguised as benevolence. What makes these myths dangerous is not that they are lies, but that they are half-truths. Dynasties really do sponsor art, fund hospitals, build institutions, but these are not gifts. They are investments. Each dollar buys loyalty, admiration, silence. The peasants of the mountains whispered prayers to their spirit lords while being harvested. Citizens of modern nations thank philanthropists for libraries while their wealth swells through monopolies, wars, and exploitation. Gratitude becomes a form of self-policing. Look at the persistence of names carved into buildings, etched onto scholarships, repeated in news cycles. That repetition is ritual. Every time you walk past a library named after a dynasty, every time a child recites the name of a family as benefactor, the myth deepens. These names survive longer than constitutions, longer than regimes. They become the furniture of society, so permanent that people stop asking who placed them there. And myths have another purpose. They create distance. The tribe made itself untouchable by weaving stories of curses and punishments for those who defied them. Modern dynasties do it through glamour. They cultivate an aura of untouchability, appearing only in carefully staged ways, in glossy magazines, at prestigious ceremonies, on podiums flanked by flags. The distance between them and ordinary men is maintained not only by wealth but by narrative. You cannot strike what you believe to be holy. The chilling symmetry is this. Whether through cannibal gods or philanthropic empires, the method is unchanged. Power survives not by force alone, but by belief. And belief, once planted, grows roots so deep that men defend their masters without realizing it. They think they are protecting tradition, progress, or destiny. In truth, they are protecting a bloodline that sees them as expendable. Beneath every myth, beneath every ritual, lies the oldest instrument of control. Fear. The mountain tribe enforced obedience by carving terror into the flesh of anyone who strayed. But terror does not always need knives. Sometimes it is enough to whisper, to let silence fester, to allow the imagination to do the work. Fear is efficient because it multiplies itself. Once seeded, it grows without further effort from the master. Institutions understood this. The church threatened eternal torment, a punishment no man could prove or disprove, yet millions obeyed for centuries. Governments brand enemies as monsters, terrorists, traitors, vague enough that the category can expand or contract as needed. Corporations create artificial scarcity, convincing men that without them, survival is impossible. In every case, fear does not need to be true. It only needs to feel possible. Notice how fear shapes memory. A single execution in the public square could silence 1,000 dissenters. One raid on a dissident's home echoes across a city. One worker fired publicly warns an entire company to fall back in line. The event is less important than its amplification. The cabin tribe left bodies as warnings. The modern state leaves televised arrests, ruined reputations, bankrupt lives. Both accomplish the same goal: obedience at scale. What makes fear potent is its invisibility. You don't always know you're being controlled by it. You call it caution, common sense, responsibility. But scratch beneath the surface and you'll find the same pulse. What will happen to me if I resist? That question is the leash. Most never tug against it hard enough to discover whether the punishment is real. The brilliance of systemic fear lies in how it becomes collective. Once enough people conform, their conformity becomes the cage. The tribe punished the outlier, the community finished the work by hunning them. Today, if you question narratives, your neighbors glare before the state even needs to act. Social punishment is cheap, effective, and merciless. Fear outsourced to the herd is the most efficient mechanism of all. And here is the darker truth. Fear does not need to be constant. It only needs to be periodic, like thunder rolling across the sky every few months. A crisis, a scandal, a purge, each one a lightning strike that reminds everyone of the storm overhead. In between, people live their lives believing themselves free. But deep down, the memory of thunder keeps them compliant. You see it in economic collapses, in wars that erupt suddenly with stories already prepared, in pandemics where invisible enemies justify visible restrictions. The pattern is always the same. Fear arrives, obedience expands, freedoms shrink. When fear recedes, obedience remains. The leash grows invisible but tighter. The tribe's cannibal rituals taught each member that survival depended on silence, complicity, and submission. Our modern rituals teach us the same, but through subtler instruments: the fear of unemployment, social exile, imprisonment, financial ruin. The flesh is not torn, but the psyche is carved just as deeply. And remember, the greatest fear is not of death, but of separation. To be cut off from the group. To be labeled outsider, traitor, deviant. That fear alone keeps men kneeling. The tribe exploited it. Institutions exploit it. Dynasties rely on it. Fear is the mortar that holds the edifice of control together, invisible yet unbreakable. Fear is only half the cage, the other half is desire. The tribe in the mountains learned early that men obey not only to avoid pain, but to gain reward. They dangled privilege before the obedient, a larger portion of meat, a closer seat by the fire, the promise of protection. These small gifts created a hierarchy where every man wanted to climb one rung higher, even if it meant surrendering his soul. Modern systems refine this into an art. They no longer need to threaten you directly, they seduce you. Promotions, bonuses, titles, status symbols, each one a modernized portion of flesh handed from the fire. And men, thinking themselves free, chase these offerings with ferocity. They become self-regulating, disciplining themselves harder than any master ever could, just for the promise of another crumb. Desire chains more securely than fear because it convinces the captive that he is free. He thinks he is pursuing his own ambitions, when in truth, the options have been scripted for him. Work harder, climb higher, consume more. The cycle never ends because it was never meant to. The mountain tribe used incest and cannibalism to keep the circle closed. Today's systems use consumerism and debt. Different rituals, same trap. What makes desire lethal is its invisibility. Men will sacrifice their health, their families, even their integrity, chasing symbols of success they did not choose. A car, a title, a corner office, a digital badge. Each is an idol placed before them, and each demands worship. The irony is brutal. The more men chase symbols, the more hollow they become, until they are shells animated only by hunger. The tribe would have called them husks. We call them successful. Look at how institutions manipulate this hunger. Corporations release products in cycles, creating artificial scarcity so men line up overnight for objects they do not need. Governments dangle tax breaks, subsidies, or welfare benefits, not as gifts, but as leashes. Religions promise eternal reward, a kingdom beyond death, if only you remain compliant in life. Every sector of power has its own version of meat by the fire, and men scramble, never seeing that the fire is consuming them. Desire also blinds. A man chasing status will ignore corruption if it benefits him. He will excuse tyranny if it promises him safety. He will protect predators if they stand between him and a promotion. The tribe demanded silence from those who received the larger share of flesh. Modern elites demand silence from those who profit under their systems. The result is the same: complicity woven into ambition. But here lies the cruelest paradox. The rewards never satisfy. The hunger is designed to grow with each feeding. This is why billionaires still claw for more, why kings waged wars after securing entire kingdoms, why the tribe's leaders demanded more flesh even when their bellies were full. The appetite is cultivated to ensure no man ever feels complete. An incomplete man is a controlled man. Fear keeps you kneeling. Desire keeps you crawling forward. Together they form the perfect mechanism. You run toward the bait while fleeing the whip, never realizing both paths lead to the same cage. And when you finally look up decades later, you wonder why you feel hollow even though you did everything right. That hollow feeling is not failure. It is the design working exactly as intended. Desire pulls individuals, but to control entire societies, something larger is required: spectacle. The tribe in the mountains understood this in its crude form. Their rituals were not hidden entirely. Some were staged, performed before the whole group. Firelight, chants, the smell of burning flesh, these were theater. They terrified, but they also unified. A common rhythm, a shared vision, a performance that made every witness complicit. Civilization never abandoned this. It perfected it. The Roman Colosseum was not built for sport. It was a machine of spectacle. Blood spilled on sand while emperors gestured to roaring crowds. Each death reminded the masses of power, but also distracted them from famine, corruption, and decay. Bread and circuses, fear softened by entertainment, the same design, scaled upward. Today's arenas glow with electric light instead of torches, but the function remains. Sports empires, award shows, political rallies, even breaking news, all serve as ritual theater. The crowd is gathered, the stage set, the narrative imposed. Heroes and villains are paraded, victories celebrated, losses mourned. And while the masses watch, while they argue about outcomes, the real workings of power remain hidden in the shadows just beyond the stage. The brilliance of spectacle is that it feels voluntary. You buy the ticket, you turn on the screen, you scroll the feed. You believe you are choosing entertainment, but what you consume is carefully curated myth. Who are the champions? Who are the villains? Which events are declared history? Which are forgotten overnight? None of this is accidental. It is ritual in the language of distraction. Notice how spectacle trains emotion. You cheer when commanded, mourn when prompted, rage when cued. Over time, the crowd becomes programmable. Political rallies exploit this directly. The flags, the chants, the music, welling at just the right moment. It is not policy being sold, but trance. The tribe did the same with drums and fire. The symbols change, the manipulation does not. And when spectacle fuses with fear and desire, its grip becomes absolute. Fear ensures you don't step outside the boundaries. Desire keeps you chasing within them. Spectacle convinces you the boundaries are exciting, meaningful, worth defending. You argue passionately about the game, the election, the celebrity scandal, never noticing that the structure of control remains untouched. There is another purpose to spectacle: purification. Societies periodically need to release pressure. A scapegoat trial, a celebrity downfall, a ritualized punishment played out for millions to witness. These events reassure the public that justice exists, that order is intact, that evil has been defeated. Yet the deeper corruption, the dynasties, the systemic cannibalism of labor and resources goes unpunished, untouched. The show absorbs your outrage so reality can continue unchallenged. In this way, spectacle is both mask and mirror. It hides what should be seen, but it also reflects what the system truly values. Watch what is glorified, and you will see the shape of control. Watch what is ignored, and you will see its crimes. The tribe's bonfires revealed both their cruelty and their cohesion. Our glowing screens do the same, only with subtler fire. Spectacle dazzles the eyes, but symbols sink into the bones. The mountain tribe carved marks into trees, painted sigils on stone, and branded their victims with shapes only they understood. To the outsider, these looked like scratches, crude decorations. To the tribe, they were binding spells, reminders that their power reached beyond the body into the unseen. Symbols carried what knives could not: memory, continuity, command. Civilizations inherited this craft. Every flag, every emblem, every crest is more than decoration. It is a condensation of narrative and power. A nation is not bound by its geography alone, but by the symbol of its flag. A corporation is not sustained only by its products, but by its logo. Dynasties last because their crests pass through centuries like talismans, outliving the flesh of their creators. The mark is eternal, even when the hand that drew it rots away. What makes symbols so dangerous is that they bypass reason. You don't analyze a flag in battle, you rally to it. You don't dissect a logo in a store, you feel the pull of familiarity, trust, desire. The tribe knew this when they carved spirals that stirred unease in any who saw them. Modern elites know this when they flood cities with brands, seals, and insignias. Symbols sink deeper than words. They strike the subconscious directly. Consider the architecture of power. Columns that mimic temples, domes that echo heavens, thrones elevated above common sight. All are symbols transmuted into stone. They whisper permanence, inevitability, superiority. Walk into a courthouse and you feel small before the towering pillars. Enter a cathedral and your gaze is forced upward. These effects are not accidents of style. They are intentional manipulations designed to engrave awe into your body. Symbols also serve as passwords among the powerful. A hand gesture, a number, a color scheme. Bandichen. Are signals to the initiated. To the public, they are invisible or meaningless. To insiders, they are proof of belonging, tickets to protection. The tribe carved spirals as warnings and invitations both. Modern dynasties etch their codes in currency, in architecture, in logos. They do not need secrecy when invisibility suffices. And symbols multiply. Every time you wear one, repeat one, salute one, you reinforce its power. Think of national anthems, brand slogans, political slogans. Words become chants, chants become spells. The repetition does not merely reflect belief, it produces it. The tribe's chants bound its members. Today's jingles and slogans bind entire populations. You do not just consume symbols, they consume you. The danger is not that symbols exist, but that they disguise themselves as neutral. You do not question the crest above the courthouse, the brand glowing in neon, the flag waving in the wind, yet each carries an unspoken demand, loyalty, submission, reverence. To resist is not simply to disagree. It is to break taboo, to risk exile. That is the hidden edge of every mark. It separates the loyal from the heretic. Symbols are the silent cannibals. They eat memory, identity, and perception, leaving only reflex. By the time you notice their grip, the mark is already carved inside you. When the tribe's mountain stronghold was first uncovered by outsiders in the late 1930s, investigators reported finding walls covered with symbols burned deep into the stone. Circles inside circles, jagged spirals, shapes that looked like eyes staring endlessly into the dark. Many assumed they were meaningless, yet those who worked long in those caves often described dreams that weren't theirs. Visions of fire, teeth and voices chanting in a tongue no one had taught them. Symbols are not passive, they work on the mind, whether you believe in them or not. Look closer at our own world and the same patterns emerge. Why is every nation's currency coated with eyes, pyramids, animals, and hidden numbers? Why does every empire drape its citizens in banners before it sends them to war? These are not aesthetic flourishes, they are psychic triggers, ancient weapons refined over centuries. The cannibal tribes of the mountains used spirals to terrify, to control, to bind their people in fear and loyalty. Modern empires do the same with flags, seals, and slogans. The technology has changed, but the principle has not. The tribe's victims were often marked before being devoured, as if the act of carving a symbol claimed ownership over their flesh. Today, when men pledge allegiance to brands, ideologies, or political parties, they too are marked, not with knives, but with invisible ink. Their loyalties are consumed, their desires redirected, their willpower weakened. The tribe's hunger was obvious, brutal, unforgettable. Modern hungers are quieter, disguised as patriotism, tradition, or even entertainment. In the aftermath of the tribe's discovery, the few photographs that escaped suppression showed crude altars surrounded by human bones. But what disturbed investigators most wasn't the bones, it was the patterns arranged around them. Skulls placed in circles, femurs stacked into spirals, pelvises balanced in geometric shapes. Death itself had been sculpted into a language. These were not trophies of violence, they were messages. To whom were they speaking? To the tribe? To their gods? Or to something darker that fed on the very act of ritual? History repeats this pattern with eerie precision. Medieval inquisitors displayed the corpses of heretics in public squares, arranging them as warnings. The French Revolution erected guillotines in city centers, turning execution into a theater of fear. Even today, the architecture of punishment is symbolic. Courthouses are elevated like temples, prisons built like labyrinths, capital punishment carried out behind closed doors, but leaked in headlines to remind the populace of consequences. The body becomes a billboard for power. The mountain tribe understood that fear must be etched into memory, not just felt in the moment. Bones arranged in ritual form burned images into the survivors' minds, ensuring that the terror lasted longer than the violence itself. Modern institutions follow the same template. Fear is codified into laws, broadcasts, even entertainment. The spectacle of punishment shapes behavior more effectively than punishment itself. You see, raw violence destroys, but symbolic violence commands. A man killed in secrecy terrifies no one. A man killed in ritual becomes a lesson for all. The tribe built their dominion on this truth, and the world still runs on it. The question is no longer whether fear controls you, but which symbols of fear you have unconsciously bowed to. By the early 1940s, fragments of the mountain tribe's story had leaked into academic journals, quickly buried under claims of exaggeration and superstition. But the fragments revealed a haunting consistency. Witnesses described the tribe's rituals as less about eating flesh and more about transferring essence. They believed that consuming their own bloodlines, brothers, sisters, children, did more than sustain the body. It locked the tribe into an eternal chain, binding generations into one organism. Identity itself was devoured, recycled, reborn. Strangely, modern power systems echo this practice in less visible ways. Dynasties marry within their circles, consolidating wealth through incestuous unions that keep resources concentrated. Corporations devour smaller competitors, rebranding them under a single identity until the original disappears. Nations consume their own citizens' futures, mortgaging generations yet unborn to pay for wars and debts. Flesh may not always be eaten, but lives, legacies, and freedoms certainly are. The pattern is the same, a closed loop of consumption, where the system feeds on its own to survive. The tribe understood this as law. Nothing leaves the circle. Outsiders were food, insiders were sacrament. Modern systems follow the same logic, though cloaked in contracts, policies, and patriotic oaths. You do not realize when your energy is harvested, your loyalty consumed, your individuality erased in favor of a larger, hungrier identity. You are told it is for family, for company, for country, and you comply, because the alternative is exile, and exile feels like death. The chilling truth is that cannibalism was never about meat alone. It was about dominance, continuity, the recycling of essence to maintain control. And if you look closely, you will see that we live inside a society that practices the same principles, only dressed in suits, laws, and logos. When the caves were finally sealed, officials declared the mountain tribe extinct. Reports vanished into archives, labeled as curiosities of anthropology. Yet symbols from their rituals began to surface in unexpected places, etched into prison walls, carved on backcountry barns, even painted discreetly in alleys of major American cities during the 1950s. Too scattered to form a movement, but too deliberate to be coincidence. Someone had carried the marks forward. Someone wanted the language of domination preserved. What happens when a ritual doesn't die but mutates? It hides inside culture, slipping from temple to courtroom, from cave to screen. Consider how entertainment today thrives on simulated cannibalism of identity. Reality television devours reputations. Social media feeds on outrage, envy, and humiliation. Millions watch strangers consume each other's dignity for spectacle, never noticing that the ritual continues, only dressed in neon and broadcast live. The tribe's bone circles are reborn as viral trends. Power never discards tools that work. Fear, symbols, and sacrifice are repackaged to suit new eras. The tribe may have vanished in blood and secrecy, but their operating system endures. Every time you surrender individuality to the mob, every time you are coerced into chanting slogans you didn't write, every time you trade privacy for belonging, you participate in the same cycle. Your flesh isn't eaten, but your freedom is. Your bones aren't displayed, but your data is. And just as with the tribe, the process is dressed as sacred necessity, for unity, for safety, for progress. The caves were sealed, yes, but caves are never only physical, they exist in the mind, dark hollows where fear, ritual, and obedience intertwine, and unless you recognize when you're standing inside one, you will never know who is feeding on you. The final truth of the mountain tribe is not that they were monsters, but that they were mirrors. Their rituals of incest and cannibalism were not random savageries. They were deliberate systems of control, crafted to erase individuality and bind the tribe into one obedient body. They did in blood what modern institutions do in contracts, laws, and culture: dissolve the self into the collective, harvest loyalty, and ensure no one escapes the circle. That is why their story was buried. Because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. You begin to recognize how governments sacrifice citizens for empire, how corporations consume workers to sustain endless growth, how media devours attention until nothing of your own mind remains. The tribe's rituals were crude but honest. Our world's rituals are polished, disguised as progress, prosperity, and order. The effect is the same: a few feast while the many are consumed. The question is not whether cannibal tribes existed. The question is how their principles live on inside us. Every time you conform without question, every time you trade truth for comfort, every time you silence your own instincts to remain safe within the herd, you are reenacting their ritual. You are offering yourself to be consumed. But here lies the power. Awareness breaks the spell. Once you name the symbol, once you see the ritual, once you refuse the offering, the circle cracks. The tribe's strength was secrecy. Exposure is its death. So I ask you now, what will you choose? To remain a vessel of someone else's hunger, or to reclaim what was stolen from you? Comment below with the phrase, "I break the circle," if you are ready to see without blinders, to step outside the cave, to stop being consumed and begin consuming truth.